My name is Michelle James, and I am the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement here at Emory's Rollins School of Public Health. Today, we are very excited to bring to you career uncertainty, navigating transitions, and sector changes. In the weeks since the presidential election, many of us in public health are feeling unsettled, anxious even, about what's next. And perhaps some of you are thinking about making some changes. So we created this webinar to help you think about your next steps and remind you that the skills and expertise you've developed as behavioral health scientist, policy analyst, epidemiologist, and so much more are incredibly transferable to a variety of employers across many different sectors. The key, we think, is learning how to communicate that value and position yourself for success in a variety of new environments. And that's exactly what we hope to do today. At this time, I would like to turn the program over to Niles Friedman, a Rollins alumnus and president of our Rollins Alumni Board. Niles himself has made a number of sector changes throughout his career, and he is currently a founding executive advisor with Star Insights, where he specializes in creating and growing businesses, divisions, and core functions within organizations. In this role, he works to build strategic collaborations across sectors, industries, and geographies through his work with startups, public sector administrators, and nonprofit leaders. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Niles and our esteemed panelists. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Michelle, and welcome, everyone. It's great to see everyone's faces. Feel free to come off of video if you'd like. As Michelle mentioned, we definitely want to keep this very interactive. So we've got a chat. Feel free to bring your thoughts forward, ask any questions of us as we go through the next 55 minutes. And we'll be sure to engage you as we really get into this practical conversation about careers, transitions, what that means. And one point I wanted to mention here before we dive in is this is something really core to the alumni board. I've been on the board for 4 years now, and each year we do try to really emphasize for alumni and also for students this kind of lens of possibility. As you think about your degree, as you think about your work, maybe you're in the public sector, how can you transfer those skills over to the private sector? If you're in the private sector, how could you work in government? But also, what are the opportunities to think about ways to engage in areas of passion for yourself that might be a complement to your full-time job. So maybe you're working at the CDC right now, but you really want to do something around tech and innovation. Doesn't mean you have to make a career transition. You could do a project. You could work in a volunteer capacity. And so we, as an alumni board, this is really important for us because we want to constantly elevate sort of this lens of possibility for alum and students, but also give practical examples from alumni. So we've got 3 amazing alumni today that want to talk with you also about their careers and their arc and their changes that they've made and what that all means. And hopefully you guys can come away from this conversation with some really practical ideas, maybe an enhanced community. There's an amazing group of people on the Zoom today. We can kind of build upon that as an alumni board to really support additional ideas that you have. Additional maybe concerns or areas that you'd like for us to focus on for programming in 2025. And as I mentioned, this is something that is core to us as an alumni board, but coming out of some of the recent developments in DC, we felt it was just really important to sort of extend that branch to alumni and say, hey, there are people that are thinking about this. There are people that have made changes in their career. If you're thinking about uncertainty, here's a pathway. Here's some people you can connect with. So before we dive into some of our core questions, I'd love to just go around the group. And Jenny, maybe you can kick us off. And the idea here is, let's just hear a little bit about your background, what you started to do after Rollins, maybe some examples of different positions that you've taken and some of those changes that you've navigated through.
Sure. Thanks, Niles. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you today. And I'd say the first place to start is actually when I was at Rollins. And the PEPFAR program actually was started while I was there way back 20 plus years ago. And that was great for me because I was really invested in HIV/AIDS programming and had picked Rollins in part to be able to work with CDC on that type of activity. And so after Rollins, I was able to get a job working with a PEPFAR partner overseas in Zambia, and then transitioned back to working for CDC there. I followed that up with a position with USAID in Swaziland afterwards. And I think to me, that was my first sign that, oh, I could make transitions. At that time, it was between different government agencies. But if I was looking out for where my interests were at that time, it was HIV prevention, women's health programming. I could follow along and see where PEPFAR opportunities were happening. So after I had done several years in Swaziland as the USAID director and prevention advisor, I was ready for a different type of living environment, and I wanted to move back to the US. And at that time, USAID headquarters had position open that was great for me. And so I made another transition back to headquarters. And after a number of years, decided, I was ready for the next challenge. And I took what at that point should have been the next logical government managerial position by switching to HHS and working at HRSA for a little while. But ultimately, I realized that that was a terrible fit. And so even though I was still working on the same program, there was something about that office that was no longer resonating with me. And it was coupled with the sort of a personal transformation and transitions in my life. And I realized that I was just no longer happy with what I was doing work-wise on a daily basis. And so if anyone's familiar with Marie Kondo here on this website, see some hands raising already. Well, she's a Japanese woman who wrote The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up 10 years ago. And that, when she announced that she was going to start training people in her organizing method, and I knew that that was my favorite thing to do on the weekends and outside of work hours, I left my position at HHS and started training with Marie to become one of her first certified organizers. So we'll go into a little bit more later, I think, what it has been like to become an entrepreneur over those last 8 years, but that's a little bit about how I got started with my public health career through a number of different agencies.
All right. Well, thanks for kicking us off, Jenny. And I love that, just the way you described it, right? Because you can have a transition within an entity, an organization, this whole global health sort of space that is a little bit more traditional coming out of Rollins, right? But then how do you make sort of a 180? How do you do a 180 or a 90-degree shift? So yeah, we'll definitely get into more of the detail, but thanks for kicking us off. Jean, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah, it's great to see everyone. It's nice to talk to kind of a smaller group. And again, we definitely welcome you to put your questions or comments in the chat or come on camera if you'd like to. It's great to see some names I recognize. So when I graduated from Rollins, it was a really long time ago now. It was 2001. And I had sort of put my foot into two worlds before I even graduated from Rollins, because I did a joint law and public health program. So I did the JD MPH program. And so kind of even in school, I knew I wanted to work in some non-traditional spaces, a lot of pressure in the law school to go work in a law firm, right? That type of thing. And I knew that my passion was really in public service and public interest. I had spent a lot of time as an undergraduate where I also was at Emory, working in emergency medical services, and had seen a lot of things in the community in doing that work that I knew I wanted to use my training in health policy to try to change over the course of my career. So that's been sort of a guiding theme for me. And the social justice piece is a really strong value that I hold. And so when I have thought about transitions I have made, I think a lot of them have been guided by really wanting to be able to kind of live those values. And we can talk more about that and the importance of that in thinking about your career transitions. But for me, that's been one of the guiding factors. And so when I graduated, I went to work actually in state government, where I got to do some really cool things. In state government, I worked for a governor's office. You get to be right there in the edge of policy making, which is exciting, but exhausting and a little risky, because when you work for elected officials, your jobs change a lot as they come and go. You find yourself looking for new opportunities. And then I went to CDC. I was at CDC as a contractor and then an FTE. Then I went back to state government. And about 5 years ago, I moved into the consulting space. And I did that because it was just another way that I could kind of work on things that were really interesting to me. And again, kind of knowing your values, I think is a really important part of thinking about your transitions. You don't always have control, total control, right? I have a family, I live in Atlanta, I own a home. So, some constraints on some of those choices there, but in thinking about where I could have the most impact, it's again kind of reaching back to that who I am and what I really want to be doing that has guided a lot of the transitions for me. And I currently work now in consulting for a small business called Econometrica. We do a lot of work for HHS, especially for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and CDC Foundation. And so while I'm not in the traditional governmental public health space that I was in for almost 20 years, I think, the move to consulting has really allowed me to kind of explore new spaces and also maybe some of my interests in being a little bit more entrepreneurial, sort of like Jenny. So I'm happy to talk more about that as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jean. And again, it's just another example, right, of like government, federal, government, state, local, right? How do you translate that over into consulting, academia? So just, yeah, it's a very amazing sort of arc that I'd love we'll continue to build upon. Karen, would love to hear your kind of background and sort of your arc after Rollins.
It's nice to be with everyone today, and thanks for joining us. So after Rollins, I had a global health MPH and joined a government contractor for several years, working in the sphere of influence of USAID back in Washington, D.C. I then joined USAID and I was there for a decade. And so I honestly thought that was kind of my dream job, and it really was. I got to do amazing work, really focused on maternal and newborn health. And I'm so proud of my government service, and the work and the folks I did the work with and the kinds of things I contributed to. About 5 years ago, actually almost 6 years ago, our family decided that we wanted to move to the Midwest, where I'm from, to be closer to my family, and decided that we would start looking for jobs in Minnesota. Not a public health hotspot necessarily, and definitely not a global health hotspot. So I actually made a transition. I was really surprised I had the opportunity to do that, but I made it a really intentional transition from federal government to working for the Minnesota Department of Health. So I joined their team to manage maternal and child health, family planning programs all over the state. I actually had someone at my goodbye party at USAID say, I didn't know you could make the transition from global health to domestic public health. And that has really stuck with me. That conversation has really stuck with me. And I can tell you that you can make that transition. I loved my time at the state, but I think, as Jean said, it's both exciting and you're like in the middle of things. And like, I personally can point to policies and laws that were created because of my work. That is both great and it is so exhausting sometimes. So a job came open at a private foundation here in Minneapolis. They just someone in global health to manage their global health grants. And it's like 12 miles from my house. And I was like, well, I think they're actually looking for me. So I applied and was able to make that transition. I had a hard time making the decision to actually leave state government because that's, so close to my heart. And I know that work was making a difference. And I really felt like, I was burned out having lived through the pandemic and trying to manage programs. And I really my personal life has improved a lot in making that transition. And it has been better for me, for my family. And it took me a long time to actually come out of that burnout to see how bad it was. So I feel really lucky to have been given that gift of a transition and threw my hat in when I didn't think that I didn't know if I would be able to do this kind of work. But one of the things that made a big difference is just sort of the environment that my job is now has allowed me to sort of see things a little bit more clearly. And I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. And I think what's really interesting about, as you guys were talking, there's this kind of thread, Jean, you mentioned values. Jenny, you mentioned, hey, this isn't a good fit. Karen mentioned some other influences that really supported her in thinking about different ways, different career trajectories, different ways to transition. But I think what's really interesting in that is if you peel that back, right, there's always this moment you have where you're in a current job and something is happening, right? It could be a lot of different factors that could be influencing you, but there's a point where you hit, it's a moment where you hit and you say, hey, I need to make a shift. And then you make that shift, and it can be external, it can be internal. But would love to explore this a little bit more, across the group. For me, just as a quick point of reference, after Rollins, I went directly into management consulting and did that for about a little under 10 years. And I'm aging myself. This was quite a few years ago where as an HPMer, that was seen as like not a traditional sort of pathway. So there was a little bit of resistance to go into management consulting. Why would you do that? You have an MPH. But what's interesting for me is it was about 8 years in, and I was working for a public company in DC called the Advisory Board, and love the work, love the people. It was an amazing organization. But I had this moment, and it was at 2 a.m. reviewing these data reports for a client. And I just knew that there was something else I wanted to do. And I went actually back into some of the courses that I had taken at Rollins, and one was around HIV and AIDS, and was talking about the global sort of reach and the global impact that it was having. Long story short, had an opportunity to work for a startup and was doing some traditional health system, global health work in Africa for about 5 years. So I'd love to hear from the group, kind of what was your kind of maybe one example as you thought about different transitions or career changes where you just kind of had that moment? What was that moment, and what was that catalyst for you to really institute and jump into something new? Jean, you want to kick us off?
Sure, I can kick us off. I think for me, probably the big transition point was when I realized that maybe my time in government was sort of coming to an end, in the sense that I had probably done all the things that I was going to do, at least in that round of working in government. And that was in 2017, 2018. I worked for the state of Georgia, and I was the state chronic disease prevention director, and had been in that role for about 5 years. And we had some transitions in our health department. We got a new commissioner who wanted me to take on a different role in the department. And it was a promotion, I think, on paper. Sometimes many of you may know this, when you get tapped for a promotion and you're in government, it's not really a choice. You're kind of told like you're going to be moving into this role. And I think for me, that role and sort of really thinking about what that meant, and the distance it was going to put between me and some of the programmatic work that I really enjoyed, and direct contact with some of the stakeholders, was really a kind of a catalyst for, I had been in government for almost 20 years, so it was a long time. And I think when you spend a long time in a particular sector, you get really used to kind of how things work, right? And like the culture, even though state government and federal government are very different, they do have a lot in common. And so kind of just realizing like, that if, I moved into this role, it was going to mean I wasn't going to be able to do the kinds of things that I thought were going to be the things where I would have the greatest impact. And maybe it was going to challenge me in some ways that would have been good to build new strengths. But I think it was kind of I had a moment of realization. And I also had a moment, I think, of sort of realization. I talked about values, I personally kind of sometimes have very strong feelings about who I work for. It's really important to me that the people that I work for, people whose values align with my own. And I really appreciate difference. But then at the same time, you kind of go, well, there are some fundamental things that if we don't see eye to eye on, it's going to make it really hard for me to support this person in this organization. And so that was when I decided that I was going to go out into the consulting space. And I think, it was ultimately, it's been a really good decision for me. I think the thing about transitions is really important, though. I would be the first person to say I haven't done all of my own transitions necessarily well, or they haven't all gone perfectly smoothly. I don't think we want you all to leave this panel with the impression that it always will. But was just, that there is like work that needs to go into learning about your new sector, and that the styles of work are potentially really different. And I think for people who leave government and go into the consulting space, it takes time. It took me almost 2 whole years to really kind of, I want to say, like, stop feeling like, I think when you're in government and you're really busy all the time, you always feel like you have to be doing something, like reacting to something. It took almost 2 whole years, quite honestly, for those feelings for me to sort of subside, and for me to figure out kind of how to best use my strengths in the private sector kind of consulting space. So that's my story. I don't know, Niles, if you want to ask someone else, or folks have questions for me about that, I'm also happy to answer them.
I have a
Yeah,
little,
no, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to for folks to just kind of build upon that, Jean. Yeah, Jenny, go ahead.
yeah, I love what Jean said, and I'd say one thing that I have to add is in 2016, I'd had this big career transition moment, sort of leaving government and starting my own business, but actually went back and did a position at State Department again with PEPFAR for a few years. And so I had a second major transition moment later in 2020. And I approached that a little bit differently. Whereas my 2016 transition had been really heavily fueled by my own intuition, how I was feeling. By the time 2020 had come around, I'd been working on my business for a little while. I took much more of what I'd say a public health approaches, in that I was really triangulating the data in my life, right? So I knew biologically at that point in 2020, like my job was kind of making me sick. It was a really hostile government situation, tough being a women's health advisor in 2020, working on global health programs. My mental health was suffering. Basic things that I like to do to take care of myself, like movement and monitoring what I'm doing, like those were all slipping. So I knew that was a problem. Behaviorally, I think about is what was I doing at work every day around then? Well, it was a lot of dealing with difficult tensions in the office, difficult navigation of policies, not seeing a lot of movement in terms of progress of what I thought or deemed important, like Jean was saying, like the values-driven programming that I enjoyed working on was being stopped. So when that comes up and you realize like, oh, most of the hours of my workday are actually not allowing me to work on skills or work towards things that I have as much belief in anymore. That was a big point for me to take note of. And then also structurally, and I think of structural as like the financial support that I'd established for myself. So at that point, like, was I ready to make another transition? Was I ready to leave this government position? So I was able to look and say, okay, I've saved up this much money that will support me for so long while I'm scaling up other work. Oh, I had clients sort of for my business ready to go, and that was income that I was going to be able to earn. So that gave me a lot more confidence to be able to say, oh, I'll be able to leave this job. And I think for me, being able to put those different 3 sets of data together made me feel a lot more confident at being able to leave and move on to the next step of my entrepreneurship journey.
Love it. Yep. And again, you can kind of start to see these common threads or common dimensions, right? It's very unique to an individual, right? But there was something that was driving that, Jenny, for you. That was something that was driving the transition, was driving the impetus, the sort of intuition to say, hey, I've got to make a shift. I love this point you're raising, though, because it really is important. And I think this really comes from having a background in public health, going to Rollins, having a master's in public health degree in particular, because I do think there's a way of thinking about challenges or problems or navigating these types of career decisions, because you're looking at it through the lens of sometimes a bit more strategic. You're looking at sort of the full picture, and you're able to see kind of what the different influences might have on you. But at the end of the day, what you're talking about is confidence, right? That ability, the confidence, the enthusiasm, the excitement to say, hey, I'm going to move from a government job into becoming an entrepreneur. I'm going to work in local government and I'm going to go into consulting. There is a level of, I think, confidence in that, but there's also a level of really wanting to learn something brand new or really getting excited by that opportunity to get involved in something that you might not know as much about. So I really do think, for me personally, I think that goes back to sort of the MPH background, but also values and other aspects. Karen, any thoughts from you on this question?
Yeah, I really think for me there were sort of three things. I mentioned my family, like my transition from federal service to working on state service. You know, I mentioned my family, like we had decided as a family that we wanted to move closer to my parents, but the other two things sort of came around at the right time. One was I had sort of ended the end of my rope at my federal service. So at USAID, I was an institutional contractor, which is quite common. And I saw my peers who were in different categories of employment being promoted. And knowing that I could never be promoted because of my category. I had a fantastic job. I loved my team. And then I watched other people be able to be the leader of the team, the leaders of another layer of team, knowing that could never be me. So I think that was sort of, you know, after 10 years being like, okay, I can be happy with this exact job forever. And at, I don't know, 30 something at that point, like that might kind of be a long time. Or I could think about making a transition. So that was one, was something like arc of my career, like where am I and where would I like to be? And I think the third thing, and Jenny mentioned this, was being a women's health advisor in certain administrations is really tough. And so I ended up in a place where I felt that my personal and professional public health ethics and values were being violated on a regular basis. And the things I was being asked to do were running in contrary to science, evidence, and good practice. And that became really difficult at some point. So those kind of three things together helped me really crystallize that yes, making a transition would be the right thing to do. But I wanted to sort of transition into like some of those skills that you brought, and Jenny really brought this forward. It's like there are skills that we all have as public health practitioners that are really helpful in thinking about transitions. And I honestly think I may have learned this from Jenny, but when I was thinking about making a transition and going into a market that I did not know, I was so methodical about it. So looking at what are my options for employment here in Minneapolis, where my family is now. So thinking, yeah, state, local, but here there's actually a very large private philanthropy field. And so I was like, well, you know, I manage grants for the government. Maybe I could do private philanthropy. And so I really went out and identified, you know, networks, sources. There's a couple of like professional networks here in town that I really went through and really methodically put in a spreadsheet, put the links in for their job pages, really focused on who might have jobs available for me. And that was ultimately what did turn up several jobs that I applied to here in Minnesota. Moving from DC, and then I already knew who had a global health program. So I've been watching the company, the philanthropy that I work for now. I have been watching to see what would happen next with them. So when that job came open, I wasn't totally ready for a transition, but I knew that was a really good job that I'd want to think about really hard before I passed on it. But that kind of really methodical research takes you a long way. It just helps you understand what are the possibilities. Who are those players? Do you know anybody is there a Rollins person there? That's also possible. So thinking through some of those things in a really practical sense.
Very good. Well, thanks, Karen. Well, that's an amazing transition to, I know one thing we really wanted to emphasize, and maybe we can open it up and folks, if you have to questions, but if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat, is this idea of skills, right? I think one of the things, when you came out of Rollins, you come out of a master's degree program, there's certain skills. You have your first job, you're building skills, right? You might have other ways that you're building skills through volunteer activities, or maybe you're an adjunct professor, whatever it might be. But I think this is a really important dimension. We talk about this a lot as an alumni board, is this ability to transfer your skills into a different sector. So let's use the example. You're an epidemiologist that works at the CDC for 10 years. Do you know how marketable you are to work in the tech sector? Do you know how marketable you can be in working in the private sector. So I'd love for folks to just talk a little bit about both hard skills and soft skills. Maybe what are some of the things that you built up across your career that allowed you to have as smooth of a transition as possible? And I think, Jean, your point is really well taken. Transitions are challenging. They can be clunky. They take a bit of time. But I think if you have this foundation of hard and soft skills, it allows you to navigate those transitions a little bit easier. So we'd love to hear from folks just about what are those skills that you built up that then supported you in making maybe a big transition in your work.
I'm happy to go first.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Go for it.
because I think when Karen was talking about her job transition, sort of something that came to mind that I think gets at your question, Niles, is just a thought for folks is that having a side gig, having something else that you do, can both help you build skills and build confidence. It also can give you a way to network with people outside of your primary position. And so for me, that has been teaching. I've been teaching at Rollins since 2003 for the executive MPH program, and I started teaching for the University of Georgia in their DRPH program a couple of years ago. And for me, that has really created opportunities to have kind of different relationships with people in outside of, you know, my government job. In particular, when I was in government, sometimes the role you're in can be really constraining because you can't say certain things, or people view you in a certain way because you represent a particular government agency. I think especially if you work in policy, people tend to view, you know, whatever you might have to say as being the viewpoint of that agency. So for me, teaching was a really good outlet to be able to kind of build those other skills. And I think, you know, we do a really good job in MPH programs in particular of kind of teaching people the, you know, skills of your trade and to build the tools in your toolbox, epidemiology, policy analysis, literature review. One thing that I do think that I observe, and I see a lot of students come back actually into DRPH programs for this very reason, is that they're looking to build more leadership skills and soft skills, communication skills, working with stakeholder groups, those kinds of things. And I think, you know, outside of government, those are probably even more important than they are inside of government, because in government, typically you're in a bureaucracy, right? There's someone in charge at the top and power kind of flows down, and people know where they fit in the structure. And when you go into the private sector, it really doesn't work that way at all. You know, one day your peer might be your boss, especially in consulting. In one meeting, they're your boss, and then you leave that meeting and they're your peer again, and you go into another meeting and you're their project manager or director. So those soft skills, I think, are something that, you know, in public health are really important for folks to focus on. And I think, you know, that's part of that transition. If you are thinking about leaving government, that I do think takes some work for most people at kind of adapting to, that, you know, the outside world, outside of governmental public health, is typically a lot flatter maybe than what we see inside government. At least that's been my experience. So.
Oh, I would absolutely concur with that point, Jean. Having worked in both sectors, the private sector, I love the way you illustrated that. Your boss in a meeting, you could have a managing director that was your primary boss, but then that boss could actually work on a project as a second that you're leading. And it's a fascinating dynamic because those are soft skills. Like, well, how do you navigate that? And you have to be in an environment and a culture that supports that. But it's a great point to sort of emphasize, because that's something, you know, if that is an environment that you really think would be conducive for you, then maybe that's a better fit than maybe a traditional government role, which can be very hurtful for obviously many reasons. Jenny, thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I love that Jean said she's seeing a lot of people's interest in leadership and health communication skills. I know that personally, those were major things and skills that helped me in my own career transition, really being able to having worked on US government health communication programs, behavior change programs, especially around sort of sexual health programming. I was able to take a lot from helping people learn how to tell the story of not just the program, which is something that's very important. That turns into a great skill set for marketing, whether it's yourself, your business, or the company that you're working for. But also the work that I do, a lot of is interpersonal and sort of working one-on-one or with families or with teams on doing organizing and decluttering work. And it's analogous behavior change to say, like, we want to increase condom use within a partnership to saying we want to increase shared household maintenance skills and stuff. And so being able to transfer and talk about those things in different ways with people, frankly, being able to talk about it from a public health perspective has been really helpful. And people say, like, oh, that's right, this is a health related program or problem that we're dealing with at home or in the office. That's been a useful set of sort of transfer of skills. And I just want to echo sort of saying that from Rollins, the skills I developed sort of in doing data analysis and doing a lot of rigorous writing and research things really helped me when I was working on my book over the last couple of years. So I was able to bring a very, research informed perspective to the writing that I was doing. My publisher said it was the most organized proposal and outline that they'd see. I said, well, that's, I'm coming from a public health program and I'm a professional organizer, so that must make sense. But those are skills that I think that you can carry through in any sector that you're working on. Writing and research and understanding the data, being able to articulate it in a great way are just such excellent opportunities. They give you such great opportunity no matter where you're working.
I love that point too, because right, you're really talking about being in character, just real quick, is like on the being a translator. Right? You're translating information. Those two examples couldn't be more different, but there's actually a lot of common elements of your ability to convey that or distill information in a way. I mean, I know this a lot from working in the tech sector. Sometimes it's not about tech. You can get really wonky into the technical aspects of technology and what that means in government. But sometimes it's, hey, let's pull that back up a level and talk about business needs or business outcomes so that something is more translatable or more digestible or there's more engagement because more people are sort of connecting with what you're trying to convey. So that's an amazing point that I do think does come out of an MPH education, because you're sort of encouraged to do that by the various courses, the dynamic nature of the different courses, and it sort of pushes your mindset into a different space. If you're doing an EPI course, a policy course, a behavioral health course, all in the same semester. I love that point. Karen, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think translation is definitely a key component of my work across my my jobs. And when it comes down to like my public health marketable skills, I was really around analysis, writing, and communication. Like I don't have the EPI background that I'm sure some of you do. And as a person who's managed a lot of programs, and it was really about synthesis, writing, like really compelling writing for a specific audience. That's been a really important component. And then also the oral communication part. But, one of the things I did a lot of in federal service was memo writing. And I'm sure I could still write a darn good memo, but that kind of distillation of information into short components that help someone who, my example is always like a political appointee who doesn't necessarily know anything about your work or have any of the background that you have. How can you bring them along? How can you help them see what you need them to see to make a decision? That same kind of perspective and audience specific writing is important in all of my work. And when I moved to the state government, at the federal service, I never interfaced, only one time in a decade did I ever interface with an elected official. It was, I didn't have the opportunity to work in Congress. Obviously, that was, way, way up the depth chart. But when I worked at the state, there's nobody else, it's you. So I really had the opportunity to do a lot of conversation with legislators And I've actually excelled at that because I had all this practice, having conversations internally, really crisp writing, and then, oral communication at a very basic level. I sort of always use I always use my mom as an example. I'm like, if I can't convince my mom, who doesn't know anything about my work, that this isn't a good idea, I can't convince a legislator. And so it's that kind of like, really low level of complexity, trying to identify complex ideas and communicate them at a level that people can understand, whether they're accountants or lawyers or in the business sector, to do that. And I still use that now with our board, who are all accountants and lawyers. That's a really strong asset that I bring from my public health background.
It really is a superpower, Karen, right? To be that ability to do that. And I love that as a proxy, right? Like someone who has no connection to your work, can they intuitively understand like what you're trying to convey? I mean, it's always a great baseline, but it's a skill. It's something that as you build that up, or if you've built that up in various jobs that you've had, that's really marketable, right? That ability to then say, hey, I've done this in the government, in the public sector for 10 years. I can now do this in the private sector or vice versa. That's one of those things I think people really respond well to. Want to quickly just engage the group. If folks had any questions, we've got a bunch of other questions for the panelists, but would love to just engage folks if you had any questions for the group. Feel free to come off mute, raise your hand.
Hi, Niles. I got a question generally for the group. So a little background, got my master's in epi, and then I worked at the CDC, and now I'm at FDA, both as an epidemiologist. But because of that, I kind of there's not a lot of outreach, talking to other people who aren't also epidemiologists. I had a little bit more of that at the CDC, but so I had a question for the panelists about like what's kind of the main outside of work activity that they engaged in that helped them communicate with other people who may not be, like you were saying about if you can't convince your mom of this thing, then you won't be able to convince a colleague. What was kind of the number one activity that helped you practice that outside of work?
Love it. Thanks, Eric, for jumping right in. Yeah, who'd love to take that question? Yeah.
One idea is you might think about what types of communities are you a part of in general, whether that's a weekend sports team or hiking group or book club, or like for me, I joined a small women's entrepreneurship club in the DC area. And so even though people were involved in different sectors, I was able to practice talking about the intention of my business, the services that I was doing. And so I was doing a lot of really, like Karen said, condensing my message and being able to share that in different groups. And that gave me sort of enhanced confidence I had to be able to talk about, and of course, to make connections with other people who might say, oh, that sounds really interesting. I know this other person who's doing something that might be helpful. Can I connect you? So I think that there are so many different ways we can be in community with people. And that's been a real challenge over the last several years. I think coming out of the COVID years, especially, or the stay-at-home years. And so I would just look to sort of wherever naturally you enjoy spending time in groups that you're spending time with, there's probably an outlet there for more people to connect with.
And I'll jump in there and say, I think, depending on sort of where you're at, like I went to work from home in 2020 and have never gone back to an office. So if you are one of those people who is still working remote, I do think that for a lot of us, or even remote part of the time, I think one of the challenges that has come out of COVID, right? There are many wonderful things. I love not having to commute. It lets me work 2 extra hours a day and spend time with my family. But I think the thing that many of us have lost is some of those third and fourth places that we might spend our time and intersect with people. And so I do just want to say, I think this is a great question because I think that we have to probably work harder at this than maybe many of us used to in terms of forming and like interacting with people, forming connections, or creating those opportunities. I think we have to work harder than we used to. I also think our society has changed a little bit, right? Like people keep to themselves a little bit more maybe than they did before. And then the other thing I think that shifts is as you get older, right? It gets a little bit more challenging to kind of connect with people. I think especially for those of us who are raising children, right? Our children take up a lot of our time that we might have otherwise spent out networking and so forth. So I want to just acknowledge that I think that that's like a really real problem for many people. And, you know, the teaching opportunities for me have been a great way. It forces me to leave my house. One of the courses I teach is in person, forces me to leave my house and go out and interact with people that I probably would not ever otherwise do and go to a place I wouldn't otherwise go to. So I almost think anything where you kind of can create those opportunities for yourself are really important. And I also think LinkedIn is another, like many people are much more open than you would probably imagine to getting an outreach that says, hey, I found your profile. I know someone who knows you. Can you give me 10 minutes? Don't ask him for half an hour. Ask him for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I just really am interested in thinking about making a job transition. Can you tell me about what you do? And most people are willing to give you 5 or 10 minutes. So I would think about those opportunities as well, but it's hard. I think it is hard, and I think you have to be really intentional about it, or to put yourself out there, which can also be a little scary or uncomfortable. So I just kind of want to say I think that that's, kind of a product of the times we live in too.
Gina,
Yeah, no, it's a good.
great. I think that's great.
Go ahead, Karen.
To emphasize both the personal and the professional network. I am not I'm in like a middlevert. I don't know what to call myself, but I'm not an extrovert. And so I really have to work hard to like do that. But I think you're right. Both my husband and I transitioned from federal service and have had lots of people contact us afterwards to be like, I know you made this transition. Will you talk to me? And both of us have been like, absolutely. We're happy to share how is it out here and what does it look like? So I think that really makes a difference. But, Eric, I would, go back to what Jenny said. It doesn't matter what kind of group, practicing those skills with neighbors, friends, do some outreach. I asked a woman who is at the same bus stop to go for a walk with me, and you just really try to put yourself out there and maybe push yourself a little bit. It will help. That kind of practice of doing it might help you feel more comfortable to do it. That in a time or a place when you feel like that could be really urgent, that someone is in a job, or someone is hiring a job and you really want to talk with them about that specific opportunity. Having those practice conversations beforehand with other people might make you feel more comfortable doing it when it might really matter.
That was great. And Eric, a couple of quick thoughts from my perspective too, just kind of building upon what was said. I think one, if you're an epidemiologist, use this as a personal example, get involved in groups that are around tech, get involved in groups that are doing work around data and analytics, right? Connect with your core group. So connect with the epidemiologists in your city, your region, but think about some that are maybe a little atypical or maybe non-traditional, because that's where I think you start to then build upon data visualization. You start to build upon the skills that you have, and then you could be at a tech social hour that's full of technologists, and they're seeing the value of you being an epidemiologist, and then you're starting to build upon that with your network. I think it's another great point that Gene mentioned with LinkedIn. There's also tons of groups that you could get connected into that are maybe non-traditional for what you currently do today. The other quick point I wanted to mention is it sounds like you've identified maybe a gap. So sometimes this can be where the entrepreneurial side of you might come into play and say, hey, I'm going to start a group because I want to bring this community together because I see the need and I see the opportunity. And I think that's kind of piggybacking on what people were saying, is that we have gotten a little bit more remote, maybe not as engaged socially in person, but maybe there's something you can spearhead to get something off the ground.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, good. We have about 5 minutes. So I'd love to do one quick round robin from the panelists. I know this is one question we wanted to highlight. and I saw something in the chat as well. Sort of, and Jean, you mentioned this earlier, like transitions can be challenging. I've done them, they're clunky, they're not always smooth, but usually you get past sort of that wave, that initial wave of some of the challenges within, like a year, maybe 6 months, maybe it takes a little longer. But I'd love to hear from you all, maybe what have been some of the challenges and how did you navigate through that on a real practical level? And maybe just use one example that you've had across your career.
I'm happy to jump in. This is a
All right.
really
Thanks,
great,
Karen.
really great question about challenges and failures. When I joined my job at the Minnesota Department of Health, we had didn't know it at the time, had about 4 months, and then COVID hit. And so obviously everything changed. But the real lesson that I took, I didn't know the counties in the state of Minnesota. I'd only been here a couple of times. Like it's a real, then like I'm managing programs across the state. It was a rough go. So giving myself a lot of humility and space, to be like, yeah, I do not even know how to pronounce these counties out here in the western part of the state. It was a challenge. So a lot of that, yeah, I don't know that. And then the other thing was, it was really the COVID process of what happened to us at the state government that made me really accept short-term decisions that may not always be the best long-term decision, but it was like I need to make a decision today. And so I'm going to make the best informed decision that I can today. And I recognize that it might not be the right thing in 6 months. And I know I'll like look back and say like I should have made a different decision. But that has been a fundamental shift in opening my eyes in my career generally is like going from like I have to make the perfect decision to allowing myself to be open to like I'm going to make the best decision today. And if it's a big failure, I'm going to be okay with it. I have to because this is what I know today. And that kind of thinking, and we did have tons of failures, but that kind of thinking really has shifted and is, I think for me, one of the most lasting impacts of the pandemic and my experience was just like, it can't always be perfect. You don't have all the information. So be more open and forgiving with yourself and others.
Right. Sometimes the most challenging part is just making the jump. Totally with you. Great. Jenny or Jean, thoughts on challenges just as you've gone through any one of your transitions?
Jean, do you want to go or?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, I was going to say, I think one of the biggest challenges was really interpersonal or personal mindset challenge that I had to go through in realizing that when I was making a transition from a leadership position in government health work to running my own business, that my professional worth was not tied to the salary I had been making. That I was not going to earn a dollar for match as I was starting my new business. And I was going to have a different sense of leadership, having been at a big organization to working for myself. And that took me just personally some time to work through. It took me some time of like being really humble and scaling up my business, having a secondary job to help support myself. And I wasn't totally surprised I had to do those things, but they were things I had to give myself a lot of grace and compassion for. So I do just, I think for anyone going through a major transition and trying something new, that if you can lead and take care of yourself with that type of mindset, you're going to hopefully fare better and at least not sort of spend too long beating yourself up about things. And then as I was establishing my business to really get to where I wanted to be financially and sort of be seen as a leadership in this new pillar, I really invested a lot in my own personal website, marketing, branding, which again, I'd known how to do that for HIV programs that I had been working on for years before, but I'd never done that for myself. And so as I, invested time and resources to develop that for myself, I really leaned into the public health expertise I was bringing into this new field. And it has really changed how I've shown up and the opportunities I've gotten in the work that I do, because it is very authentic to who I am. It really serves a niche market. People are interested in it. And so I think that too is a way to sort of say, oh, I'm still bringing all my public health work and experience along with me. I just need to package it differently based on the type of work that I want to do moving forward. And so I think that can be a really interesting opportunity for people to get involved in, depending on what they're hoping to do lead after the whatever work they're in now.
Very good. Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, Jenny, I love that. I totally think that that's such a great idea, and especially that part about investing in your brand. And one thing I tell people is, depends on where exactly you're at, but consider like on your LinkedIn profile, make your profile not solely about your current job, right? That can kind of help you with transitions and making sure you have your own identity. But just in terms of like things, I guess I would say is, I think if you're here obviously because you're a graduate of Rollins School of Public Health. And I think for many of us who are high achievers, who have been very accustomed, right, in our lives to maybe going to elite schools or performing very well at jobs or having really job titles with a lot of seniority. One of the things about transition that can be hard, I think, Jenny, you were sort of alluding to this, is letting go of some of that and not attaching your own self-worth to those things, which is tough because there's a lot of literature and science out there that says the more high achieving you've been and the more high achieving your network, right, the higher expectations you have for yourself. And just really trying to keep perspective, I think, is critical. If you are able to pay your bills, if you are able to, you know, live indoors in shelter and you're healthy, right? You have a lot of things going for you. And so sometimes job transitions, right, feel like a lot more maybe than they are. So again, trying to kind of keep that perspective, and which might include kind of connecting with people who are outside of maybe that professional network you might normally find yourself in, to kind of help you keep that perspective, I think can just be really important. There's a course out there that's I think on Coursera called The Science of Happiness. And it really just is true that, like, again, the more high achieving you've been, the higher your expectations for yourself, the maybe greater sense of loss you might feel when you let go of something that you thought was what you were supposed to be doing, or that other people think you're supposed to be doing. So I think as you go into a transition, really kind of thinking that through and then making sure you're surrounding yourself with people who are going to support you in your transition is really important.
Couldn't have been said better. Thank you, Jean. That's a great way to sort of wrap us up. We will make sure one of the things we want to do is send you all some resources. So each of us individually will be pulling together a short list of resources. And then as a follow-up today with the recording, we'll have those lists for you all. I saw something in the chat, people asking about additional resources that are available that build upon what Emory and Rollins really provide. So we're going to make sure you get all of that. We'll also have a recording of the session today, but I just want to thank Jean, Jenny, and Karen for taking time. I know this is a busy time of the year. We did this pretty quickly in response to what occurred in November. And we just want to encourage you all, as you have questions, if you've got ideas, if there's something you'd like to learn more about, reach out to Michelle James. She's really our lead for the alumni board, and we can make sure that we respond. And maybe there's a follow-up to today's conversation in 2025, but maybe there's a deep dive into some of the other areas that we've discussed. So again, thank you all for attending. Thanks for your participation. Thanks again to Jean, Jenny, and Karen. And we'll send a follow-up over the next week or so. Thanks, everyone.